Liberation Times just put out their top 5 list of UFO podcasts. I didn't agree with how they ranked them, so I adjusted it for myself. Number 5 is Tom DeLong on Joe Rogan's podcast, which is only available in its entirety on Spotify now. I put this in number 5 because of the sensational claims he was making without any substantial information to back them up. But this podcast was significant because it was recorded right before To the Stars Academy launched. And just yesterday, Theories of Everything podcast announced that they would be interviewing Tom DeLong and you can submit your questions to him. But that this interview would actually take place on Brian Keating's podcast, who also happened to be the host of the number 4 most important UFO podcast that featured Eric Weinstein and Michael Shermer. The significance of this podcast is that Eric is now officially a UFO believer. And shortly after recording this interview, Brian Keating was nominated onto the Scientific Advisory Board for the new Galileo project. The number 3 is Bob Lazar being interviewed by Joe Rogan. And although he came across as credible, he still splits the UFO community right down the middle. But this was actually Joe Rogan's 9th most popular podcast. Next is the David Fraver interview on the Lex Fridman podcast, which has become his most popular episode, because of the enlightened conversation they had about the ET possibly being of ET origin. But when the Fighter Pilot podcast interviewed Fraver, I thought it was way better, because the interviewer and Fraver both served on the Nimitz at the same time, and you could tell they were very comfortable speaking with each other. So this is a must watch. My number 1 podcast is Luis Elizondo on That UFO podcast, which occurred right after Elizondo resigned from To the Stars Academy and was shifted into second gear. What stands out in this interview is his reference to the mankind's comment he made earlier, which you can see on my profile, which he followed up with an analogy describing time in the form of a cigarette, where the ash is the past, the burning cherry is the present, and the unburnt portion is the future. And then some weirdo made a graphic about this analogy and put it on Twitter, which basically shows that the present could be experienced differently by other entities, which could result in other species possibly experiencing a significantly richer present moment. But I can also think of another Elizondo interview that I'd give 2 thumbs up to,